Welcome to LSB Feaster's Radio Aircheck and Classic TV channel.
It's 3 o'clock. I'm supposed to go on the air at 3 o'clock. Donovan couldn't time the record again, huh? Well, all right. I'm a contented man. Well, here I am again. I've been here 20 years, and it's just the same as it was the first day I started here. No commercials. 20 years, and I'm so ashamed. The most music on
77 WABC.
WABC, New York.
Dan Ingram Electric Radio Theater is on the air.
Dan Ingram, this is your life. At least, Dan, this is as much of your life as we can talk about. The Dan Ingram story, with very few exceptions, virtually the same story as that of Clark Kent, mild-mannered reporter for a large metropolitan newspaper. Actually, there are more than a few exceptions. For instance, Dan was not born on a distant doomed planet far away in space. He was born on Long Island. And to be honest, Dan's parents did not place the infant Ingram in a bubble to travel through space, although they did once give him a tricycle. Unlike Clark Kent, Dan was not raised by foster parents. Had Mr. and Mrs. Ingram known that their son was going to be a disc jockey when he grew up, he might have been. But that would have been a different story. Dan's parents were to get one of their first clues to their son's eventual destiny when, at the tender age of 13, Dan entered a disc jockey contest.
Baby, just you and me. When I come marching on.
Grand. One time. Especially Andrews sisters, I think, from single groups. Right. And today, the word of the day is puberty. And the honor group of the day, girls who wear patent leather shoes. You wear patent leather shoes, you're in the honor group. Hey, let's check today in history right now. In about 30 years from today, Joe Nolan will be born. Right, grand.
No, Dan did not win the contest, but he was not to be detoured. A strange thing happened one day as young Dan made his way through junior high into high school. Suddenly equipped with the pipes that would later sell America most everything, Dan got serious about his career. There was the college station at Hofstra, and then, armed with higher education, on to commercial radio, where jobs paid, although not much. Dan was working weekends in Bridgeport, Connecticut. To save his parents from embarrassment, he called himself Ray Taylor, and even did his own newscasts.
WICC Newsroom, Ray Taylor reporting. Next news, headlines at 9:30. You're tuned to WICC, Bridgeport, Connecticut, 600 on your dial.
Dan, I mean Ray, your record is scratchy. Better watch out. These things sometimes skip.
Good evening. Ray Taylor here in the chamber. And we'll be here until 10 o'clock with some nice ones for you. The good music on a Saturday night. On your favorite Saturday night program in Connecticut, your Ray Taylor program in the chamber. From 9:05 until 10. And the big band of the night, Sal Salvador. And all those fine brass instruments. Here he is with an original thing called Walkin' Time.
The early days of Big Ray Taylor, or. Perhaps Big Ray decided that embarrassing his folks was better than carrying around that moniker for life. So it was back to Big Dan and on to the big time. Well, maybe it wasn't exactly the big time, but just like so many hits bound for Broadway, Dan Ingram was bombing in New Haven. Here, an actual excerpt from one of Dan's shows at WNHC.
It's 11 minutes past 8 o'clock NHC time, 8:11 New Morning Mayor Dan Ingram right here in the new WNHC, AM and FM, Radio 1 in New Haven, the toast of the town. Real nice to have you with us. Your Morning Mayor Dan Ingram, the honor group of the day, the stenographers of New Haven. Our hats are off to the stenographers, and we wish you a happy run around the desk with your boss today. The latest news news, up-to-the-minute show business news from Hollywood with Jimmy Fiddler is another exclusive feature of WNHC Radio. Listen again between 10:30 and 11 for Flash News. Flash News with WNHC's exclusive Hollywood reporter, Jimmy Fiddler.
What's your favorite music? Do you like it sweet? Do you like it slow and dreamy? Or with the beat?
Dan's star was certainly ascending now. Big Dan Ingram soon outgrew New Haven, and it was off to the big time. Actually, it was off to Dallas, Texas, and one of those legendary monster radio stations of early rock and roll, K-Box.
Start the morning with a dandy. Start the morning the friendly way. You'll hear the weather and the temperature. All the news while the news is good. So here's Dan Ingram with a big hello on the Dan Ingram Show.
Oh, that's lovely right there. And right here on K-Box.
K-B-O-X, wonderful in every way.
In Dallas, Texas. That's where we are right here. The big K and big D is K-Box. K-Box Power Radio. You know, we're supposed to have the news now, but I just don't want to do it.
No buts about it.
Okay, we'll do the news.
Now, Dallas and the world.
Yeah, the four lads right there. One of the oldies from the back of the rack pulled out Dust It Off and played especially for you. One of the fine old-time tunes. Another K-Box souvenir. And you heard it.
On the Dan Ingram Show.
Yeah, you know who this is, don't you? You know who this is.
The face you see is not Clark Gable.
Yeah,
Not Liberace.
yeah.
Not even Boris Karloff. It's that unshaven, unkempt, unpressed, bleary-eyed, wonderful mess of a man.
Your morning mayor, Dan Ingram. Thank you, Galen Drake. Your mustache and your music. Boy, you're laughing and scratching pleasure. This is K-Box, the big K and big D. And this is your Dan Ingram Show. Hey, it's partly cloudy in Big D. I didn't know they were having a partly. 75 degrees in Dallas, which is right next to Big D. Shabba-dabba-dabba-doo-boo. Oh, yeah. To you. How you doing this morning? Hope you had a good night's rest. In this Monday morning session of your Morning Mayor Show, this is Big Dan Ingram doing the sounds for you. Every morning from 5:30 right up till 9 o'clock, 7 mornings a week. We make the music you like the most.
A year later, Big Dan was ready to move on. Again. Actually, at this point, Dan seemed to be headed toward an entire career as a floater, a guy who just floats from one job to another. His next stop, St. Louis, and there, Dan would put WIL on the map as the station in St. Louis.
Oh, my, Mr. Sam Cooke there, little chain gang sound. Stand by, Kimo Sabi. Coming along with the song is your friend and mine, Mr. Chubby Checker, and a whole lot of shaking going on.
Action Central News. Weather. Here's
770. Bud Clark reporting from WIL Action Central. You've just heard WIL Minuteman News. Complete Action Central News in 25 minutes.
WIL Rainbow Time, 3 minutes before 7 o'clock in your Dan Ingram fling.
Remember, you heard it. I'll bet you danced to it not so long ago. Now let's live it up again with WIL Radio.
Remember Jerry Wallace and how the time flies? Listen again now on
WIL.
We won't say how long Dan stayed at WIL, except to say he probably didn't qualify for the pension plan. But then why should he stay? Dan was finally destined for the biggest big time of them all. The top of the heap, the A number 1. His little town blues melted away. Dan signed his first contract with WABC, New York, New York. And on July 3rd, 1961, this potential broadcasting floater settled in for life.
Go right here on the live and lively one, WABC. We got the goodies just for you, baby. You keep it right where it is. Right glued to the style of the dial of the del of a cryle of a Crovney. We ready? Aim fire. Go there. Oh, that's real nifty right here on WABC, the big station serving the capital of the world. That's number 1, U.S. Bonds in 2:45.
On the Dan Ingram Show. Stay tuned to WABC and see what the weather is gonna be in New York.
Chance of showers tonight and tomorrow morning. The WABC Weather Watch says it's going to have some partial clearing later Saturday. Low temperature tonight in the 60s and the high Saturday, about 80 degrees. Right now, the temperature is 76 degrees in Brooklyn.
Within 3 months, Dan Ingram was New York City's top-rated air personality. Throughout the afternoon, we'll relive various highlights of Dan's 20 years at WABC. Dan Ingram, this is your life. And yes, before you have to remind me, yes, this is your show.
Thank you, Rick James. Like I said when they started to play that tape, I'm so ashamed. We actually, I don't believe, I would never hire anybody who sounded like that on the air. That's outrageous. I mean, really. The only thing that's really changed is my voice is about an octave lower. We got to do the opening, the old opening that we used to use.
Go, go, Dan Ingram. Go, go, go.
Well, as usual, that's not the version I used to use. That's the short version. It's the ABC way, folks. No, that was the short version. We had a whole thing about Indians back in those days, and we used to have a sidekick named Pronto used to come in every once in a while.
Me no do promo unless you play background music. That much better. Me come here to remind you to send in for official Kimo-Sabe card. Yes, you not be official Kimo-Sabe of Big Dan Ingram without official Kimo-Sabe card. You can get them free. Just send in name and address on postcard to Big Dan Ingram, WABC, New York 23. And do it right away.
Kimo-Sabe, my voice get lowered too. Yes, I noticed that. Me no talk this way anymore. Me go get PhD, get consciousness raised. Now work on Indian problem. You folks been screwing us pretty good long time. Well, you really shouldn't. You don't normally talk that way anymore, do you? No, me talk this way. Me educated now. Thank you, Prado. Nice of you to drop by. We had a lot of contests in those days, and I remember this was one of them. One of the WABC hit time, 28 minutes before 6 o'clock. And you, Dan Ingram, go. It's the WABC Who's Calling His Dog contest for $10.
Yes, just tell us who's calling his dog.
Do you have to spend the whole night screaming at that stupid animal? Oh, come on, give me a break.
Will somebody please tell us who's calling that noisy hound?
You name the dog collar for $10 from WABC.
Our pick of the earliest postcard wins.
So send your entry today to WABC, Box 770, New York. The deadline is Saturday, July 8th. The earliest postmark with the correct answer wins. Decision of the judges is final. You're swinging on the live and lively one, WABC in New York. Big Dan here doing it to you, honey bun. You, me, and lots of good sounds like U.S. Bonds, the number 1 from the Swinging 77 Sound Survey, 2:45. you ever listen to this record close up? It's got a lot of strange stuff in there. That if you listen don't listen very carefully. You'll. I think it's about time we should play a record here. We haven't played any records yet, and we're playing, incidentally, the number one weekend all weekend long. We're starting it off with tunes that hit number one in New York all through different eras, and here's one of them.
I couldn't sleep at all last night. Just thinking of you. Today I was a
Oh, I love that record. That's one of my all-time favorites, and evidently one of yours, too, because that was the number one tune of 1961, and all during the show, we'll be playing the number one tunes of individual years right here.
Ingram 20th.
That's it? Boy, they didn't spend a lot of money on jingles this time. I mean, they came in and left the studio right away. Well, anyway, we had what we called a lot of promos on the air back in the early days in 61 and 62 and 63, and I recorded a lot of them. As a matter of fact, I recorded most all of them, and this is the one that I think I'm most ashamed of, really. 71 WABC degrees in Channel 77 in New York Town.
This is the station that wished on New York and became a star. WABC.
Got a solid gold hit for you by the Sparkle Tones called Black Slacks. Black Slacks. Black Slacks. Black Slacks are filled with tacks. Ding-a-ding-a-ding-ding, a-ding-ding-ding. Everybody go. Thank you.
Black slacks. Black slacks. Black slacks.
Well, that was rather typical in those days. We had turntables, and of course now everything's on little tape cartridges. What used to be called the 4-track configuration, they're now what you play at home if you have cartridges. The 8-tracks are. I don't know what the 8-tracks are. Does anybody care? They're pretty bad, right? Anyway, there was a guy who used to work here. He was a good friend of mine, and who has gone on. He had smart. He got out of doing disc jockey work a long time ago and got into doing commercials. And you hear him probably on more commercials than just about anybody else in the business. I do some myself, but nowhere near as much as this guy. Remember Bob Lewis?
Yeah, 37 WABC degrees, and it's cloudy in our town, downtown New York town. Date if you need it, Wednesday, 17th of February, 1975. Right now, again, 37 and cloudy. All aboard.
The solid gold special coming down the track.
Hit that whistle.
77 WABC.
Babalu the Big Daddy with you on a Wallopin' Wednesday landslide, setting the die variable people first for the pass, letting the time slide roll. Dan Ingram had already been on WABC almost a year when that jingle first hit the air. My name's Bob Lewis, and I used to be known as Babaloo. And they asked me to come out of my closet here and tell you about Dan Ingram. I don't have to tell you about Dan Ingram. You know him better than I do. You've been spending 20 years listening to him. He's the only man in the world who can talk on 3 levels at the same time. This man can talk for the listener, he can talk for the advertiser, and he can talk for the other disc jockeys all at the same time. He can say the same thing, and it means 3 different things. He's probably the world's funniest man. In my honest opinion, I think he's the world's best disc jockey. He's the only disc jockey I have ever called up while he was on the air and said, you know, I hate to admit it, but you're better than I am. And he proved it. He's here longer than I am. Terrific guy, a wonderful man to work with. And you don't want to hear things like that. You want to hear funny things that happen with Dan Ingram. Of course, you realize Dan didn't always talk as fast as he talks these days. He, at times, has talked a good deal slower.
Herb Oscar Anderson, Charlie Greer, Big Dan Ingram, Cousin Bruce Morrow, Chuck Leonard, Babaloo, Ron Lundy, and yours truly, Fenwick Mouse. The All-American Go-Go Team on 77 WABC.
that may sound a little silly, but that's actually the way Dan recorded that. Of course, that's not the way you heard it on the air maybe 15 or 16 years ago. You heard this. Yeah, I'm sure you do. You know, for 20 years, everybody's been having a good time with Dan Ingram. Not just you, the people on the radio station. I was asked to think of any stories that I remembered about Dan while he's been on the air. And probably the best thing that ever happened while Dan was here that I recall was one year when we ran a contest on the air. It was for April Fool Day. And people sent in ideas as to how we could pull an April Fool's joke on Dan Ingram. Well, when Dan came in on April Fool's Day, he knew there was going to be something, but he didn't know what. And he came into the studio, he sat down, he had jingles from every other radio station in town that were played in his show. All the copy was messed up completely. Some of it was absolutely obscene, and he had to rewrite the copy as he broadcast it. And he just met every single challenge that we threw at him, and it was really fine. What he didn't know was he wasn't on the air. We had a fellow by the name of Bob Dayton in another studio doing his show, and every half hour or so they would tape a 5-minute segment of his show, and they'd take it in, and Dayton would say to the audience, you know, maybe 200,000 people a minute, let's see how Dan's doing in the other studio. He still doesn't know he's not on the air. And he went through about, I guess, 2.5 hours of his show before he finally figured out that he wasn't on the air, because being a bright fella, he happened to notice that the needles weren't kicking on the transmitter, or rather that they were kicking when he wasn't talking. And he said, that's not right, because he's used to checking everything. And he came prancing into Dayton's studio and says, all right, I got you. But it took him 2.5 hours to catch on. That's the only time it's ever taken Dan Ingram 2.5 hours to catch on to anything, because the man is probably the brightest, fastest man on his feet and with his voice of anybody in the world. I don't know whether you know it or not. You may have noticed it, but among other things, in addition to his DJing, Dan Ingram is one of the top commercial announcers in the United States. Listen to your television. You'll hear his voice all the time on maybe 100 different accounts. And he's also an awfully nice guy. And I'm very, very proud that I had the chance to work with him. I'm also proud that they asked me to say something about his 20th anniversary. Happy anniversary, Dan. I'm happy you're here 20 years. I still listen to you.
77 WABC.
Grand. Thank you. That's Bob Lewis. Bob Lewis, we used to call him. And Bob is right about all those recollections about the April Fool's Day. One thing, it did not take 2.5 hours. It took 23 minutes to be exact. And the only reason why was because we had just moved the engineer out into the studio with the disc jockey, and they had to have a meter behind him for the remote control for the transmitter. It was called the first big grievance at WABC. And there was a meter on top of this rack that had a little needle on it. It went blip, 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 like Bob said. And I looked up, and it was blipping when I wasn't blipping, so I knew something was going on. It was strange. Speaking about strange goings-on, Rick James is sitting here in the studio looking nostalgic. Would you say that's a nostalgic look upon your face, or are you just bored?
No, I'm somewhat awestruck.
Awestruck?
I think so.
Oh, come on. I've just managed to steal money from ABC for a long time. Really, the reason why I'm here this long is because when you work in the afternoon, we have here at the station what people call the blue wall. Now, the blue wall is right opposite the studio, and along the blue wall are just about all of the executives that muck things up here at WABC, and they go out to lunch. And by the time they get back from lunch, they don't know what's going on anyway, so I've been able to get away with this for a long time. They tell me you have some items from the past and things that have happened, and news events and history and all that sort of stuff.
Well, I thought it might be kind of fun, and it might even be more dramatic to demonstrate what 20 years is, just to kind of look back. And I pulled out some of the top stories of the past 20 years. We'll go year by year and just talk about them. First of all, when you started, John Kennedy was president of the United States.
True.
He had taken office on January 20th before you came here July 3rd. Robert Wagner was mayor down at City Hall. He was just beginning the third of his 3 terms. 1961 saw the Throgs Neck Bridge open for the first time.
Was it then? Gee, yes, that seems kind of recent. Houston. I always thought it was always there.
No, only in 61. I think there was a traffic jam on it about 5 minutes after they opened.
There was, I remember, yes, right.
And this was the year of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. It was also the year Americans would travel into space for the first time. Alan Shepard Jr., the first, with a 302-mile trip on May 5th. Then on July 21st, 61, Gus Grissom would make the second trip, which was exactly 1 mile longer, 303 miles. August 13th of 1961, East Germany built the Berlin Wall to stop the flood of refugees from east to west. Then 1962, on February 20th, that was the first American orbit of the Earth. And Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn did that, now a U.S. Senator. In May of 62, Adolf Eichmann executed in Israel after being convicted for his role in the extermination of 6 million Jews in Nazi Germany during World War II. This was the year 62 that would see the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a while, people would wonder if we were on the eve of World War III.
You know, you're making me feel old.
I remember this stuff, too.
I do, too, now.
Anyway, all that started back in August of 1962. It wasn't over until November when the Soviets backed down and took the missiles out. Another kind of history would be made at the University of Mississippi in 1962. A black man named James Meredith would register for classes there in the fall, escorted by federal marshals. In Rome, Pope John the 23rd convened the Second Vatican Council. Then 63, June 3rd, Pope John the 23rd died. It was a shock. He had a long illness, but much of the world was saddened. People of many other faiths were to be shaken on June 17th of 1963, as the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that no locality could require the recitation of the Lord's Prayer or any other Bible verse in public schools. The first big civil rights march in Washington would occur in the summer of 1963, 200,000 blacks and whites massing in the nation's capital August 28th. On August 30th, we would learn of an important new tool to prevent an accidental nuclear war, the Washington-Moscow hotline unveiled at the White House. Then tragedy overtook the nation November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, the assassination of President John Kennedy. 2 days later, and I think we'll all remember that weekend forever, Jack Ruby would shoot and kill the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald.
I remember that well. As a matter of fact, I was driving to work when it happened, and I remember hearing Don Gardner, who was on the air at the time on the network, say that President Kennedy was dead, and like a lot of other people, I just pulled over to the side of the road and stopped. There wasn't anything else to do. And I started the car and came into work, and it was my sad duty to be the guy to go back on the air and start to make screaming and yelling like you just heard a little while ago, and fun and games with music, and that was one of the heaviest moments of my life.
If I may say so, I think nobody has a better touch than you at times like that, and I've had the privilege of working with you during 2 recent tragic events, and
well, you just have to be honest, I guess. It's the only thing you can be.
1964. This year we would add to our vocabulary the phrase one man, one vote. It was February 17th, a Supreme Court decision ruling that congressional districts should be roughly equal in population. The violence that entered our lives late in 63 would carry over into 64. In June of that year, 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi. It was in 1964 that the Warren Commission reported into the killing of President Kennedy would be released. Here in New York, Staten Islanders finally had a road that led to the rest of the city as the Verrazano Narrow Bridge opened, and it was the year we went to the fair, the New York World's Fair opening at Flushing Meadows, mostly for New Yorkers.
Yeah, I remember. We were broadcasting live out there, and it was terrible. No, what happened was the men's room door got locked somehow, and it was really touch and go for a while. There were guys running from one pavilion to the other while they were on the air. It was funny.
64, the year that President Lyndon Johnson would win a term in his own right, a landslide victory over Barry Goldwater in November. And in 65, as the World Fair continued here in New York, was also a mayoral election year. Early in the year of 65, Dr. Martin Luther King and some 2,600 other blacks were arrested. 2,600 in Selma, Alabama. In Harlem, a few weeks later, black leader Malcolm X would be shot to death at a rally. President Lyndon Johnson would send U.S. Marines to the Dominican Republic on April 28th of 1965. On July 1st of that year, Medicare was born to help senior citizens meet their medical expenses. The summer of 1965 would see racial unrest lead to a massive riot in the Watts section of Los Angeles. November 9th, we would start asking each other the question, where were you when the lights went out?
Oh, yeah. We have some tape on that later on in the show.
Those are the first 5 years, and just very few of the things that happened in your first 5, and we'll look at 5 more in about an hour or so.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rick James. And, we have a regular, now up-to-the-minute type jingle, don't we?
Ingram's 20th. Congratulations there, WABC.
Back to the number one song of 1962. That record once as Soldier Goy, the Arab marching song. And I got a nasty letter from some Arabian gentleman who really objected. He said he was going to get all the oil-producing countries together, and no, it couldn't have been him, no. Thank you, Mother. That's nice. We did something back in Dallas, Texas. I worked in Dallas, Texas with a guy named Bob Whitney, who was a real genius at programming. I've had the luck, really great luck, of working with probably the top programming people all throughout my career in this industry, which is one of the reasons why I've been able to hang around long enough, because they gave me the tools to get the numbers. And one of the things that Bob Whitney and another guy, I can't remember his name, I'll think of it, Chuck Benson, who is, I believe, in Chicago now. Anyway, he and Chuck and I devised something called the Principal of the Year contest, which we did in Dallas, and then later in St. Louis, and then later here at WABC.
WABC wants to know, who is the Principal of the Year? Can you elect your principal, the WABC Principal of the Year? To vote for your principal, just sign your name or have a friend sign their name to a card and either bring or mail it to WABC, 39 West 66th Street, New York 23. Everyone is eligible to vote. Mom, Dad, little brother, your next door neighbor, everyone. Just make sure there's only one signature on a card, either a postcard or a standard filing card. Send it or bring it to WABC, 39 West 66th Street, New York 23. The winning principal will receive a beautiful color TV. Decision of the judges is final. Deadline Friday, June 1st at midnight. So get your vote in today for the WABC Principal of the Year.
Yeah, back in those days we used big band type music because everybody thought that, this music was terrible and you couldn't sell commercials. And I remember you couldn't get an airline to buy commercial time on WABC or any other rock station because they figured there were only kids listening. Of course, our ratings proved that to be wrong. Of course, now you hear a lot of airline commercials here on WABC. Speaking of airlines, one of the fascinating stories of my life, and I think my best friend in the whole world is Ron Lundy, is that after I'd been here at WABC for a while, Ron and I both worked together at WIL in St. Louis. I was a program director there, and I and Bob Whitney hired him from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Ron remained at WIL in St. Louis with legendary ratings. He still had 25, 30, 40% of the market long after I'd left and long after everybody else had left. And while the rest of the station had no ratings, he was on the afternoon those days and had incredible ratings, an incredible success story, and stayed there. About 5 years later, their job openings came up on WABC, one for an all-night show and one for an evening show. So there were two disc jockeys to be hired, and I recommended two disc jockeys. Luckily enough, I had heard a guy named Chuck Leonard on WWRL, and Chuck got one of the jobs, and I recommended Ron for the other one, and he got the other one. And the day I was on the air, when Ron came in to sign the papers and things, he flew in from St. Louis and was about to fly back, he stuck his head in the doorway and said, I got to run to take a plane, but we signed the papers and I'll be here in about a month. I said, the hell you're going to run? We're going to have some booze and we're going to have some steaks and talk. I haven't seen you in 4 years. I said, get a later plane. And he said, well, I'll try. So he did, and he came back about 10 minutes later and said, instead of the 6 o'clock plane from LaGuardia, I'll be taking the 10:15 out of Idlewild. And I said, that's great. So Ron and I went out, and we went to a little restaurant and had some steaks and some booze and talked. And I dropped him off at the plane, and on the way home in the car, learned that the plane he was supposed to take from LaGuardia went into Lake Michigan with 300 people on board. So every time Ryan takes a plane, he always comes in here and asks me if he should fly. We have something here from Ryan, and I'd like to hear it.
Oh, Dan.
Yes.
As you know, today is a very important day in New York history.
Oh?
I don't have to tell you about the event today represents. That's right, it's America's 205th July 4th weekend. And what could be more important than that? Today, thousands of New Yorkers will be fleeing the Big Apple for the 3-day holiday weekend. Because of WABC's love for New York City, we can't imagine why a true New Yorker would want to leave this great town, but seeing as as how today also marks your 20th anniversary at WABC. Dan, we're seriously considering leaving town, too. You know, we've worked together for 21 years. Dan, 21 years. When we worked together out in St. Louis way back when, I don't even want to remember. I was hoping that you'd go far in the business. But Dan, you didn't go far enough. I was really hoping you'd end up in Nova Scotia, London, Peking, anywhere outside of this country. So imagine my shock when I came to ABC in 1965, only to see you again. It's taken me 21 years to say this, Dan. Stop following me around. Now, let's look back on this questionable career of yours. For years, New Yorkers have been going home with Big Dan Ingram. Many others had to simply settle for listening to you on the radio. But when they do, they all share one thing in common: listening to the unique Dan Ingram brand of humor. Oh. Now, I want New Yorkers to try this experiment tonight when they drive home or driving home right now. Take a look at the people in the cars around you. Do they have big smiles on their faces? Well, you can bet that they're listening to Dan Ingram. Either that or somebody else is in the car hiding that you can't see. You know, Dan, we have been through a lot during your stay here at WABC. And by golly, we've seen them come and go, right? 4 New York mayors, 6 American presidents, 8 men who walked on the moon, and several dozen WABC disc jockeys.
Some of whom walked on the moon.
I gotta hand it to you. Lord knows I've been for the last 3 minutes, but you have an admirable ability to sustain the same program day in, day out, year in, year out. It's amazing, the devotion to your craft, your loyalty, your sensitivity, and one outstanding quality, a basic masochistic urge to keep doing this to yourself, and I just can't figure that out. So here's to the next 20 years, Dan. We all salute the definitive radio personality, as Howard Cosell would say, a true professional, and one of the premier radio greats in the United States. Most importantly, we have you right here in New York, right where you belong. So just remember this: when you think of radio, you think of studio. Right. And when you think of the first 4 letters of studio, you got to think of Dan Ingram. Dan, I love you. As 21 years ago, just like today, I think you're the best I ever heard. God love you and congratulations.
Thank you, Ryan. That's awfully nice. Ryan just walked into the studio, as a matter of fact.
Well, you know, it's become a cliche over the years, you know, because we were back to back, you know, for 100 years on the air together. Sure. You know, I was on from 10, you were on at 2, and Dan will be in at 2 o'clock. And always said, you know, my best friend in the whole world. Right. Well, not only that, you're the best friend I ever had in my life.
Well, thank you.
And I know what your all-time favorite song is. It's very few people that know this. Oh. Now, I know what your... Now, I mean, besides all the Neil Sedaka songs, I know you have all those at home on a loop that just plays continuously when you ring your doorbell.
You can one of those Bolton systems so you can play different Neil Sedaka records in different rooms.
Well, we know your fondness for Neil Sedaka. Yeah. But, Dan, you've got to, if you're honest now, you've got to admit, this was your all-time favorite recording.
Hello again.
I love it.
Here's my best to you. Are your skies all gray? I hope they're blue.
Mercy.
Let me sing my song to you.
In case you might have forgotten, that's Herb Oscar Anderson. And hello again. His theme song. I used to hear this every morning because he was 2 minutes late every morning and didn't want to get here, so he played the record. As a matter of fact, for the first 15 minutes, it was usually the Klaus Gruber show because Klaus was his engineer. He would do it all himself. We're going to hear the whole damn thing? Why not? Let's listen to it all. And now the best part of the whole record.
Hello
condominiums now, isn't he? I think so, yeah. Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Herb.
Let the past forever be the
Herb, you always should have been on WOR. It's really, you would have been perfect there. That's true.
my hand. I'll say once more.
One of the nice guys in the business, by the way.
Hello again.
Herb Oscar Anderson, who was the morning mayor. You may have heard some of the earlier air checks where I was copying him, calling myself the morning mayor of New Haven or the morning mayor of Dallas. He's the guy that started it all. One of the all-time greats. And he's living down south now and doing very well. We're very happy for him. Listen, I got to embarrass Ron Lundy because Ron Lundy, when he was at WIL, was known as the Wild Child. Yes, he was the Wild Child. Now, how this came about? Should I tell the story about Whitney in the paper?
I don't think anybody believe it, but it's the truth.
It's a true story. We were on the air on WIL, and it's one of the few... St. Louis, Broadcast House, St. Louis 8, you know. And it's one of the few stations with a W call letter because the transmitter was east of the Mississippi River in East St. Louis, Illinois, and that's where you got the W. Anything east of the Mississippi is W, anything west is K. KDKA, now their transmitter's on the west side of the Monongahela River, which goes into the Mississippi, and that's why it's K. Anyway, it's true. We're on the air on WIL, and our competition, what is it, KXOK? KWK. Brought in a kid from Cleveland who called himself the Wild Child. Only they took a full-page, double-spread ad in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and all it said is, the Wild Child is coming to KWK, and they spelled it W-I-L, apostrophe. And our program guy, Bob Whitney, said, the hell they're going to use our call letters. And we had just hired Ron. He hadn't gone on the air yet, and we got Ron, who proceeded to take off his shoes and do his show barefoot. And we started that morning promoting every 15 minutes the real Wild Child on WIL. And we went on the air. The kid who went from Cleveland, I've forgotten whatever happened to him, poor guy. He went on the air at 6 o'clock, and we went on the air at 7 o'clock with Ron Lundy as the Wild Child. And as a matter of fact, we were listening to KWK, and the guy on the air must have segued about 5 records because he heard somebody else doing his act on the number 1 station, and we blew him out of the tub. It was cold, wasn't it, Ron?
That was cold.
Well, this is the way it used to sound when you followed me.
Right.
This was on WIL, and this was my old closing theme, which I used to use here, by the way, for about a year before I got to the new. We'll tell you where that music came from later on. This is a close of my show going into Ron Lundy. You'll notice that on this station, there are no nuances. It's all screaming. Listen to this.
For this afternoon. Thanks a ball for checking in, Kemosabe. We'll check you out again tomorrow, sometime between 4 and 7 in the afternoon hours. You stand by, baby, because coming up next, the original WIL Child, the Wild Child, his purple polka dot loincloth, his records, and the hair between his toes.
very civil in those days, right? That was when you were doing the character of Billy the Sissy, as I remember.
Yeah,
right.
2 guns and more lipstick, right?
That was great fun. Yeah, you see, we never played records on that station.
No,
there was all intros.
Contests and promos and
intros and promos.
Right.
On the level, if we played 8 records an hour, we played a lot. And it's going to be...
records were like 2 minutes.
2-minute record. We have one 2-minute record coming up in a little while. Before that, if you remember your pet tiger Fuzz.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we had a contest promo that Ron did that I'd love to play right now.
Number 12 in the WIL Silver Dollar Survey. Whole lot of shaking going on.
WIL pays off. The latest electronic report from the WIL Cash Tabulator.
Today, WIL has awarded $76,951.24 to lucky WIL listeners. Stand by, St. Louis. You can win too.
But probably won't. I always wanted to change the call letters of WIL to KRAS, Crass Radio. It was a whole different story in those days. I got another one. This is something that this will explain itself if we just play it right now.
Most music on
WABC, New York.
We really didn't hear the last few words of the Ron Lundy show. I mean, Ronald is one of my dearest friends, which shows you what lousy taste I got. But anyway, would you say your final words, please?
Bye.
Thank you very much, Ron.
WABC, San Ingram, go, go, go!
Forever! No, you left out the rest of it, Ron. You said bye. You forgot the 5 lines. Love you madly for all the things you are, and you know what you are, you little devil. Where's that savage Indian?
Come to me.
Right,
You look like big hors d'oeuvres. Put you on spits.
touch me, I'll pull your feather.
No touch, that's not feather, idiot.
Record come in upcut. They swing 'em wide swath. I don't believe this. All right, the Ingram, Lundy, whatever thing. Just love me tonight, or whatever you got a minute. Tom Jones, number 12. Mike Hayes, 30 seconds.
I know that it's late.
Always the pessimist. Those are great days, Ron Lundy, and even though you're on from 9 to noon now, and I'm on from 3 to 7, we still manage to bump into each other every once in a while, like yesterday.
Every so often,
yeah. Hey, thanks for dropping by, bud.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Okay, we gotta play a record here because we should play some. But I remember this record, and I think of the title now, and it has a whole different meaning to me. This is called Sugar Shack. Sugar Shack. Yeah, the record's worst yard in those days. That was the number 1 record of, I guess it was 63 we're up to now, right? Yeah, number 1 record of 1963. Sugar Shack. Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs, wasn't it? Yes, I've forgotten it. I don't have it in front of me, but my fading memory comes back to me. We have real news here today, as opposed to some of the reminiscing with Rick James we'll be doing at 25 after the hour. We'll have the shadow traffic, for real shadow traffic, with Joe Nolan to tell you what's happening, and we got to get you up to date a little bit. And then right after that, you heard Bob Lewis refer to what happened on April Fool's Day way back in 1964. Well, we have a bunch of that for you right after the news. Right here.
WABC, Action Central News.
The festive atmosphere of this 4th of July holiday weekend has been marred already by a subway accident in Brooklyn.